Hello, welcome. This is Business Week, coming to you from our studio here in Lagos, the nation's commercial capital. I am Frank Kamalape. Here's what coming up on Business Week. The federal government has kicked off 2 programs targeted at alleviating the impact of the fuel subsidy removal, the Presidential Conditional Grant Program and the Presidential Palliative Loan Program. Plus, players in the Nigerian automotive industry are to get funding support from government in support of their operations. And finally, the World Bank has unveiled plans to allocate $5 billion to bring electricity to 100 million people in Africa by the end of the decade. Of these and many more are what to expect on the show today. Stay with us. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. Let's begin with major stories that made headline in the course of the week. The federal government has announced the kickoff of 2 programs targeted at alleviating the impacts of the fuel subsidy removal, the Presidential Conditional Grant Program and the Presidential Palliative Loan Program. This was revealed in a statement by the Minister for Industry, Trade and Investment, Ms. Doris Uzokaniti. In the Presidential Conditional Grant Program, the federal government will disburse a grant sum of 50,000 naira to nano businesses across the 774 local government areas in the country, as well as $75 billion naira to micro, small and medium-sized enterprises across various sectors and 75 billion naira specifically to manufacturers. These loans shall be administered to the beneficiaries at a single-digit interest rate of 9% per annum. And away from there now, the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum and Regulatory Commission has reviewed the federal government's plan to revoke unused oil exploration leases that companies were granted but have not been able to carry out any exploration activities on them. Latest data from the NUPRC shows that about 53 exploration leases were issued from 2003 till date, but over 60% of the prospecting licenses issued to local and foreign oil firms had expired. Chief Executive Officer of NUPRC, Mr. Gbenga Komolafe, said the Commission will initiate reviews of these leases and awards of new leases will be subject to specific terms and conditions. Mr. Komolafe, however, stated that only companies with viable technical and financial backup will get to keep their leases. And our players in the Nigerian automotive industry are soon to get funding support from government in support of their operations. The country's automotive development authorities who made this known say efforts are ongoing to make the funding opportunity a reality. Here is Lara Folanyo's report.
The Nigerian automotive manufacturing industry has over the years grappled with many setbacks. Funding, forex supply, and even policies are some of them. Car importation has also not helped matters, as most Nigerians prefer imported vehicles. This has in turn resulted in the local assemblers producing below installed capacity. The automotive development authorities are worried about the sector situation and are now working towards putting a fund in place for players to access for indigenous production, while striving to boost market access for the locally produced vehicles.
To boost patronage of Nigeria-made vehicles, we need investors. We need people to have that confidence and faith in whatever we put together.
The fund is an offshoot of the National Automotive Industry Development Plan, aimed at enhancing local production. The idea is not to put an end to the country's existing auto credit scheme, which is also a part of the Auto Development Plan, but to see how more low-cost funding can be made available to operators.
There must be rule, there must be law, there must be policy. Thankfully, we have NAIDP policy. That plan. It's a plan, it's a document. Until we start implementing it, it remains documents. When we start putting them into action, then it becomes it's no longer the document we are keeping.
The automotive development authorities are positive that when the auto development plan becomes an act of parliament, it will boost investor confidence in the sector. They also feel that the plan will help drive local content in auto production towards getting the country better prepared for demands of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement's implementation. The Automotive Development Authorities also urged that plans are ongoing to put in place needed infrastructure for electric cars. Lara Folayo, TVC News, Abuja.
And now the World Bank has unveiled plans to allocate $5 billion to bring electricity to 100 million people in Africa by the end of the decade. This was made known by the president of the World Bank, Mr. J. Banga, at the midterm review of the International Development Association's $93 billion replenishment package in Zanzibar, Tanzania. Mr. Banga said that the current 20th IDA funding is due to be completed on June 30, 2025, with the Zanzibar conference aimed at adding to that funding. The president urged World Bank shareholders, donor countries, and philanthropies to help IDA deliver better development outcomes to lower-income countries. And outside Nigeria, figures from a recruitment platform Indeed shows Britain's labour market remains tight despite a fall in job postings by employers over the course of 2023 and broader weakness in the economy. The reports show that there were 48% more job postings at the start of December last year on Indeed than before the COVID-19 pandemic, but December 2023 data shows this had shrunk to 10%. Indeed, data showed advertised salaries in Britain in 3 months to the end of October were 7% higher than a year earlier, compared with increases of 4.2% in the United States and 3.8% in the Eurozone. The Bank of England is closely watching Britain's job market as it worries that labour shortages will keep the wage growth high and make it hard to get inflation or the way back to its 2% target after it hit a 41-year high of 11.1% in October 2022. Well, coming up in a moment, our focus is on Nigeria's participation in COP28 and the benefit for the country. Please stay with us. You've been watching Business Week coming to you from our studios here. Let's get into our conversation for today. Addressing the issue of flooding and mitigating its devastating effects on the most vulnerable populations. It's a central focus of Nigeria's participation in COP28 Climate Summit. Beyond immediate relief, COP28 presents a platform for Nigeria to advocate for long-term solutions and secure international support. This includes accessing vital financial and technological resources to implement its national climate action plans, invest in renewable energy solutions, and build climate-resilient infrastructure. Well, for more information, I'm joined by the Senior Manager and Lead ESG and Climate Change Services, Mr. Temitope Kolade. He joins us virtually now. Thank you, Mr. Kolade, for joining us on the show. Let's get started now. How can Nigeria leverage its participation in the COP28 Climate Summit to attract foreign investment in green technologies and sustainable development initiative with regards to, building a more resilient future? Let's start from there.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the key concerns that's been raised the ongoing COP28 is the fact that there is need for climate finance, especially in the other parts of the world that have been more impacted, that have been the recipients of the climate change impact across the world. We've seen like the biggest single deal of UAE pledging $30 billion, for instance, to a new fund to invest in climate-friendly projects across the globe. Of course, they say about 5 billion of that goes to the global south. A couple of other countries are making commitments. World Bank in particular also says it's going to increase its climate funding to about 45% of its total lending, and that's about $9 billion every year. So funds are being, countries are committing to a lot of funding, initiatives, I would say. And if that is there, Nigeria can definitely tap into that. How do we tap into that? by showing good cause that indeed we are ready to join hands with the rest of the world to deal with the challenges, whether it's for us to look at it from the point of clean climate cooling, for instance, or it's in form of diversifying away from fossil fuel and going into renewable energy. Lots of projects that can be done from even sustainable agriculture and several others that we could say we want to deploy those funds to. And so it shouldn't be a jamboree. Anyone committing their funds, whether it's climate-related fund, green funding, or whatever it is, what they want to see is that good cause that you are ready to demonstrate, that you're going to put it to judicious use, and there is going to be a demonstration of transparency, accountability, and integrity in the application of the funds, so long they are provided. So that's something that is very important. And I believe that Nigeria showing good cause would help to attract those sort of funds, and it would help the country to indeed fast-track growth in the critical areas that require development.
Well, you talked about climate financing and the support from the rest of the world to developing countries like Nigeria, where this support is only secured on a negotiation table. So how much can Nigeria get out of this table?
Yeah, I would say we had, definitely. And one of the critical comments that I believe the president also made at one of the meetings at the ongoing COP28 is to say that, you know what, the Western part of the world has benefited more from industrialization, which is what has resulted in lots of emission that the rest of the world is trying to clean up. When you think about global emission, if my knowledge serves me right, my memory serves me right, Africa as a whole contributes less than 4% to the emissions that we're trying to take out of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, we are that part of the world that has not fully developed. And so it's more expensive to go green in a way, at least at the beginning. And so when you say the rest of the world should be sustainable, we begin to think about just transition. And that's what brings us to the table. Yes, we want to transition from use of fossil fuel, we want to use renewable energy, but initial capital outlay is going to be more, and the rest of the world that is pushing for these have gone ahead to also do things that have resulted into lots of emission into the atmosphere. So it's enough reason for us to ask from the rest of the world to say, you know what, you want us to go green, then you've got to support us because you've advanced your economies. And so if you give us funds, we'll be able to develop here, and then you'll see the results for your funds as well. So I would say we are indeed at the negotiating table. A lot of the government agencies have been, at that event as well. And I know that particularly the president has also appointed the chairman of the FRS to lead a carbon credit initiative to ensure that the rest of the world, like the Association of the ET, for instance, Energy Transition Accelerators, also collaborate to bring the funds into Nigeria in one way or the other, whether by virtue of carbon credits that would then help to indeed fast-track development in the critical areas of the economy.
Let's talk about commitment. How can Nigeria ensure that the commitment and agreement reached at the summit translate into concrete actions and lasting results beyond the duration of the summit?
Okay, thank you very much. Apparently, my belief is that the tone at the top is always very critical, is always very important to any conversation. So we can't downplay the commitments that are being made, because it serves as a note to every parastatal of government, because this is not just about the Ministry of Environment, for instance. It's not just about raising funds. It's something that impacts every aspect of the economy. There's something that is called the concept of circular economy, right, when it comes to climate change issues. And the point is just that it's something that should impact every part of the economy. So where you are producing waste, you can use it to regenerate revenue for the nation. So what do we do differently beyond that commitment that is being made? Number one, we have established the fact that the commitments are very important to serve as a tone at the top for everyone to follow through. And the next steps would then be to develop whatever commitments that we have into actionable steps, right, that would impact. For instance, maybe we want to do the pilot 100 buses that are green in nature. I mean, they're using renewable energy sources to power them, electric buses, for instance. That impacts on the transportation, but that's only the pilot stage. How do we ensure that we scale that and impact on everything that everybody is doing? How do we ensure that climate education is done and everybody understands the importance of actually converting whatever waste that they produced into other resources that are useful for the system? Right, so that has to go into the educational curriculum. So every part of the economy needs to sit together, and critical stakeholders need to sit together, not just the public sector people, but the private sector. And then, of course, from a business side of things, people in the private sector need to own the sort of IFRS initiative, for instance, to ensure that they begin to report on critical steps there in terms of their climate-related risk and opportunities. Right. So these are things that, of course, every agency of government, for instance, the FRCN, which is the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, also has a role to play in ensuring that they demand compliance from people, and then we'll then begin to go from compliance and mere commitment, so to speak, to actionable steps, and we see people doing things differently. I think that's what we really need to do, to have different actionable steps communicated to the right stakeholders across the country, across the society, and they begin to see the need to actually have things turn around. And it's not just a matter of climate change being a buzzword, but something that everybody owns and is doing something about.
I know you talked about actionable steps, right? But we also need to look at strategies, as a way of, backup for these actionable steps. So what practical strategies can Nigeria implement to strengthen its climate adaptation strategies and mitigate the impact of flooding and other extreme weather events?
Okay, thank you. Well, the truth is that it's not just about flooding, for instance. So you think about food security, there are a couple of things. The changing weather patterns, for instance, has implication on altered rainfall and temperature variations. And that means that farmers cannot do things the same way they've always done it. So they need to understand how weather works, and they also need to begin to work with NIMET's prediction on weather situations. So there are floods that you may be able to control. There are those that there may be just natural causes. There are those that we need to take more fundamental approach to. So when we think about the strategies to deal with them, we'll then say, what does the Ministry of Agriculture need to do? What does the Ministry of Environment need to do? How do we ensure that when we, for instance, mine granite, right? Are we creating a gully for erosion? Are we creating some channels that cannot be controlled when the water then pours down and it floods an entire place? Do we need to build dikes, for instance? And again, we need to go back to who are the people that are involved in taking those steps? Yes, in terms of policy, government needs to, number one, give a policy direction on what they want to do to address the impacts that we are seeing, and not just address the impacts, but the root cause, right? And then step away from that and say, yes, how do we ensure that those policies are implemented? How do we get the stakeholders to do that? If they are private people, what is the penalty if you don't do things right? For instance, if you step back and you say, okay, let's go to the oil and gas sector. What do we see with gas flaring, right? What actionable steps are we going to ensure that we make in terms of when people flare gases, what's the punishment for it? And if you don't flare, is there incentive for it, right? Government needs to communicate that. And of course, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So we need to ensure again that indeed there are measurement steps, monitoring steps from the government parties, from regulators, to ensure that people actually comply with whatever laws, and that people don't go backdoor and say, oh, you know what, just waive this for me and then I'll have my way around it. Again, everything runs in a circle. When you think about food distribution, for instance, extreme weather events have great impacts for even distribution of food in terms of transportation. I mean, just like you mentioned, at some point in Kogi State, people were traveling at some point, but they couldn't get to where they wanted to go to because of flooding issues. It destroyed farmlands also, right? These things have various impacts on the health sector, for instance. How does that also impact on the nutrition and the health of people? So it's something that is multifaceted, right? But in terms of the approach, I would say again that we need to identify who the critical stakeholders are. What's the role of government? What's the role of the people and the private citizens? And how do we ensure that everybody gets their acts right and begin to do things the way we want them to do it? There has to be a communication, and then there has to be a monitoring system to ensure that we then enforce whatever policy that we have put in place.
I would like to go in a moment, but I want us to look at few issues before I let you go. Let's look at some key indicators that can be used to measure the success of Nigeria's efforts to address climate change. And second is the role of local communities in driving climate action and ensuring that Nigeria's response to climate change is inclusive and equitable.
Okay, thank you very much. What are the metrics? How do we measure success? That's a big one, I will tell you. And one of the things that Nigeria has done, for instance, is that it's communicated its nationally determined contributions to dealing with climate change issues to the UNCCC, right? That's the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, right? And those are critical things that we could look at, whether in the private sector or even the public sector, and say, how do we ensure that this is done? One of the things that across the world we want to do is to ensure that we bring rising temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, but that could be big for people to even understand what it is, right? So again, we need to go back to the various sectors and say, how do we ensure that indeed these things are trackable? These things are things that we can trace and we can measure over time. One of the things that we will readily see is that our imports will get better. For instance, we will not continue to import so much food if we are able to conserve the food that we have in Nigeria, store them, and then we can export them. We would have better exports, right? But again, that could be something that is big that we may not easily be able to measure, but it's something that the National Bureau of Statistics would help us to measure over time. But in terms of quick steps, you begin to see that maybe again, we are beginning to, if we're to talk about flooding, we'll begin to have less flooding, and then flash flooding or whatever it is in those areas will be dealt with, because we can actually collect the water that is running off, and we can utilize it. We can use it to even produce electricity. We can use it for irrigation. We can store them up, right? A couple of things that we can do, we'll begin to see those communicated to us by those who are running the private, the pilot projects, or whether it's they have scaled it, right? And what do we need the local communities to do? Unfortunately, most of the people within the local communities are likely to think of climate change as something that is an act of God, which is not always the case. Right. So for me, I think that education is necessary in the first place. And then we then need to begin to educate people that they can do things differently. We need to give clean cooking stove to them, and we need to get them to embrace it and not continue to burn fire, to use firewood for cooking, that even creates other health issues for them, aside from the fumes that it generates in the atmosphere. We need to ensure that people are able to sustain their means of livelihood, because if they can't, in the most decent manner, they will get into harmful practices for the environment. So once we begin to see them, educate them on those critical things that they need to do with respect to their cooking, to their source of electricity, to their means of livelihood, and they make it sustainable, then we begin to see a change in mindsets from those people, and then we'll see better results as well.
Thank you, Mr. Timito Kwekolade. We appreciate your time for coming on Business Week. Have a great day.
All right, thanks a lot. Have a blessed day.
Well, you've been watching Business Week from our studios here. And before we wrap it up on the show, let's take a look at the breakdown of the 2024 appropriation bill. And that's our time on this edition of the program. Thank you for watching. I am Franco Malabe. I'll see you next time.